So, people have been crying out for a brand new F-Zero game since the outstanding F-Zero GX came out on the GameCube. And while Nintendo has yet to deliver on that front, other developers have taken up the mantle in providing the fast-paced, futuristic arcade-style racing games we all want. And Redout is one of the best ones we've seen in years. Here we're looking at the PC version running in all its glory, native 1080p, epic settings, and at an unwavering 60 frames per second. And what can I say? It looks and feels superb to play. Smooth, slick action, along with crisp controls and some absolutely beautiful visuals. Structures tower above the track line, while sunlight reflects across the various surfaces, resulting in a level of specular sheen usually found in arcade games from the late 90s and early 2000s. It's an absolutely awesome looking presentation. And of course, like with any futuristic arcade-style racing game, frame rate is incredibly important. Running at 60 frames per second simply delivers a better connection between the player and the game. Every button press, turn of the analog stick feeds into what we're seeing on screen much more quickly than say a 30 FPS title. And this basically gives us a better sync with the action, allowing us to react more quickly and thus produce more enjoyable gameplay. But running at ultra high frame rates also has other benefits. The increased temporal resolution allows the visuals to stand out in ways that's not possible on a 30 FPS title. You really do notice more of the nuances in terms of the visual effects and texture work on offer, and that means that speeding through these lush environments is simply a joy to do. And the PC version definitely hands in the goods here, but what about the consoles? Redout wasn't a particularly demanding game to run on PC, but you did need to dial back certain settings to hit 60 frames per second on lower mid-range cards, such as post-processing. And with the move to consoles, we were kind of wondering how close the game would be getting. Really, the ideal choice here is to sacrifice certain visual effects in order to maintain that ultra high frame rate. 60 FPS is paramount in a racing game like this, and ultimately sacrificing some level of visual flair is a worthy trade-off for keeping that frame rate. But ultimately what we have is a kind of interesting mix on consoles. Across PS4 Pro, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, it's clear that the experience varies wildly on each of these platforms, and not all of them deliver that 60 FPS lock we want, and this impacts greatly on the experience. We'll start off here with the PlayStation 4 platforms. In terms of basic resolution, it's native 1080p across base PS4 and PS4 Pro, and overall the visual quality appears very close to that of the PC version running at max settings, the Epic preset. It's not an exact match though, and the key upgrades on PC consist of high quality ambient occlusion, which creates deeper indirect shading in areas where the objects meet, something that is quite subtle during gameplay but stands out a bit more prominently during the pre-race sequences. And you've also got slightly higher quality anti-aliasing too, which smooths over edges just a touch more than on console. But otherwise, both PS4 and PS4 Pro essentially offer up an almost identical visual experience to the PC version. It's difficult to spot some of the upgrades on PC when looking at static screenshots, and during the race it's likely that they're really not going to add too much to the overall experience. When it comes to the PS4 and the Pro then, we actually struggle to see any variances between the two in terms of core graphical quality. Identical 1080p resolution is here, backed up with, well, the same level of textures and effects work, to the point where we actually wondered if there was really a true Pro implementation at all here. But there is one big benefit to PlayStation 4 Pro, and that is a boost in frame rate, or rather should I say a more consistent frame rate. Redout is a 60 frames per second game by design, and on PlayStation 4 Pro, well, that's exactly what you get. Performance here is excellent, and you definitely get the sense that you're looking at the same kind of experience you see on PC. Crisp, responsive controls, super slick motion, and just a great connection between the player and what's happening on screen, and it looks absolutely great. Sure, it's just 1080p resolution, but if you're using a 1080p screen, really that's not a problem. And once the action really heats up and you start speeding along, then all the post-processing creates a certain degree of softness anyway, so it's not razor sharp. But the important fact is that the game hits that 60 FPS target pretty effortlessly. It's not absolutely perfect, there's the occasional 1 FPS drop, but let's be clear, this doesn't stand out during gameplay and is pretty meaningless all round. it looks and feels great to play. So that's PS4 Pro, and arguably I'd say this is by far the best way to play the game on consoles. But when we move down to base PS4 hardware, it's clear that the experience really isn't quite as good as it should be. Comparing the game up against the Pro, and well, the problem is pretty obvious. While PS4 Pro delivers that 60 FPS lock for the vast majority of the time, on PS4 the game really struggles with hitting 60 frames per second, with things often going far below, somewhere into the kind of 45-50 FPS no man's land. But it can be really variable at points, dropping slightly below or even going above, right up to that 60 FPS mark we want. The result is that the game does feel far more uneven to play. There are moments where you can be zipping along and the experience feels very smooth, say when frame rates are going above 50 FPS, but then there are moments of stutter where somehow the game feels a little bit more weighty at points than at others. And since this can vary quite a lot, it means we don't get the absolutely sort of locked smoothness we get on PlayStation 4 Pro. Now, after a period of adjustment, I did manage to find the PlayStation 4 version fairly enjoyable to play, but at the same time I do find the drops in performance distracting, and after playing the brand new Wipeout remaster on PS4 and indeed Redout on the PS4 Pro, it's clear to me that a locked 60 FPS really is paramount. The game is still playable, but there's a sense that perhaps the developer could have dialed back some of the visual effects such as the post-processing in order to better hit the 60 FPS target. For me personally, maintaining that level of smoothness in a game like this is more important than layering on as much visual eye candy as possible. After all, we want the game to play really well, and if you've got a 60 FPS frame rate, then even with some visual downgrades, games can still look excellent due to the extra temporal resolution and sheer smoothness on offer. So that's PlayStation 4. It does a serviceable job at delivering Redout to consoles, but where the disappointment kicks in is with regards to the Xbox One version. Resolution wise, it's 972p, which creates a slightly softer image, but once you're speeding along the track with all the post-processing, it becomes far less noticeable and, well, almost a non-issue at times. Scenes which are clearer may not appear quite as sharp, but really it's not that big a deal. Alongside resolution, effects work and draw distances are pared back slightly in several areas. For example, light sources in some scenes are kind of moved around a bit, along with the shadows that they cast, resulting in variances in how some scenes are illuminated between PS4 and Xbox One. And then there's the draw distance and level of detail streaming, both of which are more aggressively handled on Xbox One. Things such as distant buildings are culled at the beginning of a race, while higher quality assets pop in a little later compared to PS4 and PC. While the differences aren't exactly drastic, this does lead to a slightly less refined presentation on Microsoft's console. But really the issue we have here is with performance. Redout is a 60 frames per second game, but on Xbox One, it's clear that the developers didn't have the kind of headroom required to hit 60 FPS with any kind of consistency, and so we're looking at a 30 FPS cap. By all intents, Redout operates at 30 frames per second on Xbox One, and I've got some, well, good and bad news here. The good news is that the frame rate seems to be fairly stable at 30 FPS. There's a couple of small dips just below, say 1-2 FPS perhaps, nothing major, although it is arguably disappointing that we're seeing any dips below 30 FPS at all, but it's fairly stable at 30. The downside is that the experience is still very uneven, and there's a lot of judder at times, which kind of is quite distracting. What's happening here is uneven frame pacing. While the game may be reading out at smooth 30 frames per second, you'll notice frame times jumping from anywhere between 16 to 33 and 50 milliseconds depending what's going on. And when you combine that with the reduced frame rate down to 30 FPS, there's definitely the feeling that you're not getting that super slick, awesome arcade style experience that you get on other platforms. Certainly PS4 Pro and PC deliver some exceptional gameplay at really high frame rates, but ultimately on Xbox One it kind of feels a bit lagging, a bit disappointing. In that respect, it's kind of hard to see what choices the developer would have here. Severely pare back the visuals in order to hit 60 frames per second and perhaps be criticised for the game looking worse on Microsoft's platform, Or alternatively, go with a 30 FPS cap and have the gameplay suffer from the lower frame rate. It's kind of a difficult decision. Personally, I would be in favour of downgrading the visuals to hit 60, but ultimately what we have here is the opposite. The visuals remaining as close as possible to the other versions, but with frame rate running at 30 frames per second, albeit with some significant frame pacing issues. Really, when it comes to playing Redout on consoles, the decision is pretty clear. PlayStation 4 Pro delivers an awesome experience and it comes highly recommended. It's an awesome game and that version absolutely delivers. Meanwhile, the base PS4 is kind of acceptable. The game's playable and I'd argue the results are better than a 30 FPS cap, but the wavering frame rate is certainly not ideal, and it's worth considering that before you buy. While the Xbox One version, well, for a 60 FPS game it's not something I could overly recommend. Sure, it's playable at 30 frames per second, but with the improper frame pacing it just doesn't feel as refined as it should do, and I feel the overall polished arcadiness present in the PC and Pro versions is kind of missing here. And so that brings me on to the Nintendo Switch version. The Switch game isn't available yet, but seeing the results on console, it kind of leads to an interesting question. What route will the developers take when porting the game to Switch? Redout is using the Unreal Engine 4, and in the past with the likes of Snake Pass for instance, we've seen the developer pare back the resolution and target 30 frames per second instead of 60, while keeping visual quality in other areas reasonably comparable to say the full-fat PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions. While on the other hand there's the potential to essentially go the other way, pare back visuals to more last-gen standards while attempting to hit 60 frames per second. I suspect that maybe we'll be looking at a lower resolution along with a 30 frames per second cap. Judging by the performance on Xbox One, that definitely seems to be the most likely scenario there. Anyway, that's something we'll definitely be checking out in another video, so keep an eye out for that. But I think I'll leave it there for now. I hope you enjoyed this look at Redout, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also remember to check out our Patreon and support us there, where you'll have access to the high quality version of this video which features pristine image quality that really shows off the benefits of 60 frames per second action. As ever, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.